Man, your face looks disgusting.
The words fell like a knife in the quiet restaurant. A few chuckles rang out from the next table, full of mockery. The man stood there, old apron, tray in hand, eyes slightly downcast. Under the cold fluorescent light, the long scar glistened like a burn that had never gone away. He didn't react. Not a word. Just silence. Then, from the corner of the room, a boy stood up, looked dead directly at them, and said exactly 6 words. Have you ever seen injustice like this? Type, yes, if it broke your heart too. Welcome to TNM. Let's uncover what really happened. Early in the morning in a small neighborhood on the outskirts of Boston, when the sunlight was still creeping through the frosted glass windows, the Nana Maria's Deli diner was bustling like a classic jazz song. Bustling, but orderly. From behind the kitchen counter, the sizzling sound of bacon hitting the grill mixed with the smell of freshly brewed Arabica coffee, creating a unique poetic scent that the locals called the Sin of Awakening. Jake Morrison walked quickly like a shadow, sliding down the narrow aisle between the tables. He was tall, his back slightly hunched as if he was carrying an invisible backpack that had become too heavy with time. One hand held a stainless steel tray, the other gently poured a glass of orange juice. His eyes always glancing at the customers to make sure no one had to wait too long. The movements were practiced to the point of being skillful. The cappuccino cup was placed down without making a sound. The plate of buttered toast fell onto the table in the right place, not a single millimeter off. Table 4, 1 Eggs Benedict. 2 pancakes with syrup, 1 black tea with little sugar. He whispered to the cook and turned to leave. From behind, the apron draped across his waist. The scars on his neck and left cheek were faintly visible, like smudged ink on an unsent war letter. That was the first thing that made people look at Jake, and then immediately look away. A 6-year-old child sat with his mother at the corner table. When Jake approached with a tray of food, the boy immediately shrank back against his mother's back. Eyes wide as he stared at his face as if he were seeing something from a horror movie. His mother smiled politely, said thank you softly, then used a napkin to wipe her son's mouth as if to divert attention. Jake just nodded, expressionless. He was used to that look, like the day the stylish woman ordered a latte. But when he brought it, she left the words, "Leave it there, don't come near." Or the young man in the red hoodie, biting into a piece of bread and whispering to his friend, "This guy looks like a character in a zombie game." Jake heard everything. He always heard. But he didn't respond. For him, every whisper was like the wind blowing through a torn shirt. It couldn't be torn again. And so, the day passed. He continued to serve, clean, and answer customers in a low, calm voice. No one knew that beneath the rolled-up shirt and worn-out leather shoes was a body that had endured fire and waves, a survivor of a place no one would dare call normal life. The owner, Maria, an Italian woman in her 70s, had joked when Jake dropped the first tray, "Your hands are as strong as a special forces soldier, but your feet walk like someone who is afraid of breaking someone's heart." It was true. Jake walked as lightly as if the world beneath his feet were made of glass. Outside, the sound of a tram clanged in the cold wind. Inside, Jake poured another cup of coffee and placed it in front of a man who was burying his face in his laptop. No one looked up. And no one knew that every step he took silently carried with it fragments of memories from the battlefield that had not yet burned out, like ashes still smoldering under the embers. Jake walked away from the battlefield with his legs intact, but his soul was not. In the first days after being discharged from the hospital, he wandered through job centers, carrying in his hands a stack of documents filled with medals, certificates of merit, and photos from his time in the army. No one asked about the medals. They just asked, "That scar, was it an accident?" And then, a limp handshake and a polite refusal. "We'll get back to you, Jake." No one called back. Jake did every job he could, loading in a cold storage warehouse, cleaning a park, working as a night guard in an empty parking lot. But people's eyes, the eyes of avoidance, fear, sometimes disgust, still haunted him like the moonless darkness. It wasn't until Maria, the owner of the small restaurant on the Italian Quarter, looked him straight in the eye and said, "I'm not hiring your face, I'm hiring your heart. Starting tomorrow morning." That Jake found some peace. The small restaurant on the corner was crowded on Sunday as usual. The noise in the restaurant seemed to never stop. The oven was red hot. The coffee maker hissed like the gasps of an overworked morning. Jake weaved like an artist between the crowded tables, holding a tray of orange juice in his right hand, a tray of buttered toast in his left, and strips of bacon rolled up like a work of art, even in his frayed apron. His movements were as neat and precise as when he had disassembled and reassembled a gun in the darkness of the battlefield. Jake was used to this work rhythm. The way he put the hot cup of coffee down on the table without spilling even a drop. The way he bowed his head slightly every time a customer complained, then silently turned away. Without needing to react, he understood that sometimes words were unnecessary, especially when his face, with its concave and convex scars stretching from his temples to his chin, said so many things people didn't want to hear. That morning, a strange family walked into the shop. The man wore a neat moss-green military uniform, a pair of shiny silver medals on his shoulders. The wife was discreet and gentle. The boy beside him was about 10 years old, Tommy, with big eyes and slightly curly brown hair. He sat down at the farthest table, where the soft light streamed in through the frosted glass windows. Jake walked over, placing the menus in front of them. The father's eyes lingered on his face for a moment, then quickly moved away. Nothing strange. But the boy, Tommy, didn't. He looked up at Jake, not with a shy or fearful gaze, but with a curious, quiet, and familiar one. His gaze was quiet, without curiosity, without fear. Just a deep attention, as if searching for something between Jake's steady steps, his careful movements. Every time Jake turned away, the boy continued to look, never once leaving his eyes. Jake felt it, but said nothing. He just continued working. His hands were steady, but his heart sometimes couldn't be so steady, especially when he passed by the tables of customers whispering behind him. He turned away, carrying the food to the next table. Just then, another customer, middle-aged, gray suit, slicked back hair, called out in a contemptuous tone, "Hey, man, your face looks disgusting." The sound of glasses hitting plates, spoons falling to the floor, everything seemed to stop at once. The atmosphere in the restaurant seemed to slow down for a moment. Jake paused. His grip on the tray tightened a little, but his expression did not change. He just lowered his head and continued walking. Tommy followed him. His eyes widened. There was no pity in them. Only something very deep, like memories were awakening. Just as Jake bent down to clear a nearby table, an old badge fell from his pocket onto the tiled floor. It was a Special Forces badge, faded with age, with chipped edges and scratches. Tommy quickly walked over to pick it up. He turned the badge in his hand, his eyes fixed on the tiny carving on it, a falcon spreading its wings. The symbol of the battalion his father had told him about. The father was startled. He stood up, his face pale, when he saw the familiar symbol in his son's hand. Tommy turned to Jake, who was standing there, quietly wiping the table, the light shining on his bullet-ridden face, and the boy said loudly, clearly, as if speaking for the whole restaurant to hear, "That scar was worth every penny." The air was dead silent. All eyes were on the boy, and the man whose face no one dared to look at for long. No one spoke immediately. The man in the gray suit, the one who had just spoken harshly, quickly lowered his head, awkwardly looking back at the menu as if it could save him from the heavy silence that had filled the space. The other customers also began to look at each other, hesitant. The waitress at the coffee counter paused in the middle of pouring milk. Jake stood still. His hand shook slightly, not from hurt, but from the memory. The boy's voice, resolute and clear, echoed somewhere far away in his mind, like a bell from a time he thought he had buried. Tommy stepped closer, carefully handing back the badge. "My dad told me about this battalion," the boy said softly. "I remember the Falcon." Jake took the badge, his hand shaking slightly. He looked up at the man standing behind Tommy, the senior officer, his face frozen. A moment passed. Then the officer stepped forward. He said nothing. He just looked at Jake. That gaze was not that of a stranger. No longer avoiding. No longer avoiding the scars or the skin that had been burned by bullets. It was the gaze of a man who owed someone his life. He took a deep breath. Then he spoke, softly. But each word seemed to weigh heavily in the air. "Jake, is that you?" Jake nodded. Just a simple nod. But in his eyes at that moment, hundreds of hours on the battlefield appeared. The calls to comrades amid bullets, hands pulling each other through barbed wire, and a soldier, badly wounded, being carried on his shoulders in the dark of night, through a minefield to survive. The officer took a step back. He put his hand on his son's shoulder, then bowed to Jake, right in the middle of the restaurant, before dozens of astonished eyes. Jake stepped back, surprised. In all his years of service, he had never seen an officer bow to a subordinate, especially now, when he was just a waiter with a face that made people avoid him. Tommy looked up at his father, then at Jake. His eyes sparkled, shining with an unnamed emotion. Jake bent down, tucking the badge back into his pocket. The action was subtle, but it put a part of him back in his rightful place, not under the scornful gaze of a stranger, but in the memory of a child, in the recognition of someone he had saved. The doorbell rang again. A new group of customers entered. The restaurant returned to its old rhythm, but nothing was the same anymore. In the silence that seemed to freeze, everyone's eyes turned to the boy who had just uttered those 6 words that had silenced the entire bar. Tommy stood there, his hands clenched tightly around the hem of his shirt, but his gaze was unusually steady. He looked at the customer who had insulted Jake, then at his father. The father, Lieutenant Colonel Alan Harper, slowly stood up. His face tightened, shifting from confusion to a painful and profound realization. He approached Jake, as if pulled back by an irresistible force. His eyes stopped at the Special Forces badge on the floor, the one Jake had accidentally dropped while carrying the items. He paused. His heart pounded. He stammered. You were in Kandahar, right? Jake looked up. The two men's gazes locked. Their shared history flashed in that moment of silence, like a slow-motion film replaying the smoky days. We were trapped in that Humvee, Harper continued, his voice low, as if he were asking himself. The vehicle hit a mine. Someone shielded us from the second blast. That person, his face was so badly injured that I didn't recognize him. He choked. Jake said nothing, just nodded. Harper put his hands on Jake's shoulders. His hands, once as hard as steel, were shaking slightly. If you hadn't saved me that day, this boy would never have been born. Tommy stepped forward, his eyes brimming with tears but still glowing with a fierce conviction. I wrote an essay about you in history class, he whispered, but I never thought I'd see you in person. Jake bowed his head slightly, as if he were once again standing in the middle of a battlefield. But this time, not to fight, but to be heard, to be acknowledged, and to be forgiven for the years he blamed himself for surviving. One by one, the people in the bar stood up. The silence was broken by a slow round of applause from the table by the window. Then another. Then everyone. The applause rolled in warm waves, washing away the cold looks, the harsh whispers that had clung to Jake like a shadow. The atmosphere in the restaurant seemed to tighten after those 6 soft words. The boy named Tommy was now standing next to Jake, his head slightly raised, his eyes not trembling but sparkling. There was something in that gaze that was beyond his 10 years, something that made the entire restaurant freeze for a few heartbeats. Jake stood there, his hand still holding the tray with a few empty glasses. His hand shook slightly, not because it was heavy, but because the memories had just come flooding back like a raging wave. There was a longer silence than usual. Then footsteps. A man left the table. It was him, Colonel Harper, his father, his officer, and his old comrade. He approached Jake, his leather shoes clicking dryly against the wooden floor. Each step seemed to carry decades of buried regret. Harper stopped right in front of Jake. He said nothing for a few seconds. The steely gaze of an officer who had commanded hundreds of men cracked. Then, suddenly, he did something no one expected him to do. He dropped to one knee on the floor. The chair creaked. A sharp intake of breath. Everyone in the bar, including the old woman behind the counter, fell silent. I'm sorry. Harper's voice was hoarse, his eyes looking up at Jake. I didn't know who saved my life back then. I didn't know that he would carry the scars for the rest of his life. But now I know. You were the one who pulled me out of that Humvee. You were the one who shielded us from the shrapnel. You, he looked at his son, are the reason he's standing here today. Jake said nothing. He squeezed the tray lightly, as if to retain some of his composure. Harper stood up, carefully taking something old from his breast pocket, a Special Forces badge, the badge of the unit he and Jake had served in. I keep this as a souvenir, but it belongs to you. He placed it in Jake's hand, where the calluses from his training days still remained. Jake looked down. His throat tightened. His vision was blurred not by the smoke from the stove, but by the tears that were threatening to spill over after years of not allowing himself to cry. And then, Tommy hugged him. No hesitation. No glance at the scar. Just a simple hug. Warm, steady, sincere. You wrote an essay about the unknown soldier who saved your father in Kandahar. Now, you are no longer unknown. Jake fell to his knees, hugging the boy back. A breaking sound came from inside, not a sob, but the snapping of chains of guilt. A middle-aged man at the corner table stood up. Then a woman pushed her chair back from the table and clapped. One, then two, then the whole place. The applause rang out like a call for redemption, like a triumphant march of kindness. Jake was still kneeling, but he no longer bowed his head. A ray of late afternoon sunlight filtered through the glass window, illuminating the long scar on his right cheek. The light hit it, not shying away, not fearing. The news didn't spread that day. No one immediately came to shake Jake's hand or invite him on television. It all came slowly, like the gentle dawn that dispels the darkness, bit by bit. The story begins with a video shot on a phone, shaky, not perfectly focused, but the emotion intact. A young customer, a communications student, was sitting near Tommy's table that day. He happened to film the moment the boy stood up, pointed at the waiter with a scarred face, and said clearly like a declaration, "That scar is worth every penny." The video was posted to TikTok and YouTube with a short caption, "You'll never guess who this waiter really is." 24 hours later, the video reached 3 million views. In the comments section, people left hundreds of thousands of thanks, apologies for public indifference, and stories from other veterans who had suffered similar fates. Some recognized Jake. They were Army nurses, former comrades, or people who had just met him briefly at the field hospital. The memories were real and touching. The local government could not ignore him. A week later, the mayor invited Jake to the city hall to present him with a certificate of recognition and thanks for his wartime sacrifice, something that should have been done long ago. Local television picked up the story. The first article appeared in the Daily Tribune with the headline, "The Man Whose Face Carried His Life." The National Veterans Organization contacted Jake through Harper's introduction. They invited him to a meeting, initially just to share, not to speak. But it was his simplicity, humility, and calm eyes that made people listen in silence. Jake didn't talk about his achievements. He talked about the loneliness in the hospital, about the look in the eyes of the first woman who saw him after the bandages were removed, about the silence that lasted for years when no one remembered what he had done. That sharing was recorded, lightly edited, and posted on the organization's YouTube channel. Within 2 weeks, the video had more than 10 million views. The national press got involved. Soon, schools, community groups, and charities were reaching out to invite Jake to participate in sharing sessions, hoping that students and the public would understand. Appearance does not say the true value of a person. But the special thing was, Jake did not seek those opportunities. He only did one thing, stood firm in the storm, quietly doing his job well, without needing applause. And that was what made people come closer to him. From being whispered about behind his back, Jake became a symbol of recovery, of quiet courage. One morning in June at a suburban high school, Jake stood on a small wooden podium. Below him, 400 seniors listened intently. He raised his hand and pointed to his face. The scars were still there, unable to be hidden. "I used to think these scars were a curse," he said. "But maybe they're a reminder that I survived, that I did the right thing, even if no one knew my name." The applause rang out. Not because he was a hero, but because he was a man who had bravely walked through pain and made others fearless in the face of hurt. That day, Jake returned to the diner. The boy Tommy had been a regular visitor, now seeing Jake as a friend. On the table, Tommy had left a scribbled picture, a man in an apron, holding a tray of food, with a light shining through the window behind him. Beneath it, he had written, "Scars are medals, you just don't pin them." Jake smiled, the last light of day illuminating his face. The scars had not faded, but now no one would turn their backs on them. The world may forget your medals, but it will never forget your kindness.